Late September, Savannah. A master restorer cracks open a 1840s Broadwood Grand from a ruined Carolina plantation. His flashlight sweeps the darkness inside, and touches folded paper no one has seen since 1859. One line stops his heart: "If you are reading this, I am already dead, and the truth must finally come to light." What he found next wasn't just a letter. It was divine judgment, sealed in mahogany and felt. Thomas Vance had always believed that instruments carried souls. Not in some romantic, ghostly way, but in the biblical sense. Wood remembers. Strings remember. Felt and ivory remember the press of fingers that once sinned or prayed or wept. For 37 years his workshop on the Savannah River had been a confessional of another kind, a place where broken things were laid bare, stripped to their bones, and given back their voices. But nothing in those 37 years prepared him for the Tuesday in late September when the old Broadwood arrived. The delivery truck backed slowly down the narrow alley behind the converted warehouse. Rain had just stopped, the air was thick, warm, and heavy with the smell of river mud and wet live oak. Two men in faded overalls eased the massive crate onto a hydraulic lift. The elder one, face like sun-cracked leather, eyes that had seen too many old houses emptied, signed the paperwork without a word. He only paused once, hand on the crate, and muttered, "This one, she been waiting a long time." Then he climbed back into the cab and drove off, leaving the scent of damp pine and something sharper: mildew, yes, but also the faint, sweet rot of secrets long denied. Thomas wiped his hands on a rag and circled the crate like a man approaching an altar. The mahogany case, when the lid came off, was the color of dried blood left too long in the sun. 1840s British craftsmanship, Broadwood & Sons, London, the gold-stamped nameplate still faintly legible beneath a century of dust. The ivory keys had yellowed to the shade of old bone. The fallboard, once mirror-bright, now wore a dull haze that swallowed the overhead lamps. And from deep inside the instrument rose a smell that made Thomas's skin tighten, not just dust and mildew, but the unmistakable breath of a house that had known grief. Damp Spanish moss. River silt. And something metallic, like old blood dried between floorboards. He had restored pianos that once belonged to presidents. He had coaxed song from instruments that survived Sherman's march. But this one felt different the moment he laid his palms on the case. It felt watched. Edmund Hartwell, the client, had bought the Broadwood at a low-country estate auction 3 hours north, in the rice fields above Charleston. Hartwell was the kind of man who collected history the way others collected stamps, obsessively, precisely, without sentiment. Restore her to the exact voice she had in 1845, he had written. No modern shortcuts. She must sing as she sang for the Ashworth family. Thomas had agreed without hesitation. He did not know then that the Ashworth name still carried weight in certain old parlors, and that weight was not entirely honorable. He began the work the way he always did, with reverence and documentation. The workshop lights hummed low and gold, throwing long shadows across the scarred pine floor. Outside, the Savannah River moved past the windows like a slow, dark sermon, patient, inexorable. Thomas photographed every inch. He ran his fingers along the warped mahogany, feeling the lifted veneer flutter like dead skin. Several keys stuck halfway down, as if the piano itself refused to let go of the last notes it had been forced to play. The soundboard, that thin, sacred spruce diaphragm, was spiderwebbed with cracks so fine they looked like the handwriting of God on the Day of Judgment. This was no ordinary repair. This was resurrection. Day by day he dismantled her with the slow, deliberate care of a surgeon. The action, hundreds of tiny hammers, felted shanks, and delicate springs, came out first, each piece labeled and laid in velvet-lined trays like relics. The strings, once bright copper and steel, came off one by one, coiling in his hands like sleeping serpents. He worked by the river's rhythm, early mornings when mist still clung to the live oaks, late nights when the only sound was the soft scrape of his chisel and the occasional distant horn from a freighter heading out to sea. On the fourth morning, something changed. Thomas was lifting the heavy action frame when he felt it, a gap. Not the usual hairline tolerance between frame and soundboard, but a deliberate, unnatural half-inch chasm running the full length of the belly. In a piano engineered to the standards of 1840s London, such a void should not exist. It looked intentional. like a hidden compartment built by a craftsman who knew exactly what he was concealing. He froze. The workshop fell utterly silent except for the river outside and the sudden, loud thud of his own heartbeat. He took the powerful LED worklight, angled the beam into the darkness, and leaned in until his breath stirred century-old dust. Motes swirled like gray ghosts. Dried felt. The husks of dead insects. And then, at the very back, pressed tight against the soundboard, a folded edge of paper, pale as bone. Thomas's first instinct was professional: call the client. Photograph. Document. His second instinct was older. Primal. The same instinct that makes a man pause before opening a grave. He chose the second. With a thin, flexible probe he had used 1,000 times on delicate restorations, he reached in. The paper slid out as if it had been waiting for a human hand since the day it was hidden. It was brittle, the color of weak tea, the ink faded to the color of dried blood. But the handwriting was elegant, educated, the hand of someone who had once taught music to the daughters of Carolina planters. Thomas carried the letter to the tall window where afternoon light poured across the workbench like judgment. He unfolded it with the care of a man handling the shroud itself. The date at the top, March 15, 1859. The salutation, simply Catherine. And the first line, written in a hand that trembled even across the decades. If you are reading this, then I am already dead, and the truth must finally come to light. Thomas read it once. Then again. Then a third time, the words, burning themselves into his memory like brands. The letter was signed by James Whitfield, music tutor to the Ashworth family of the Low Country. It was a confession. It began in the winter of 1846. Margaret Ashworth, eldest daughter of the richest rice and indigo planter on the Ashley River, had discovered she was with child. The father was not some suitable cousin or neighboring heir. The father was James Whitfield himself, the quiet, bookish Englishman who had arrived in Charleston in 1844 with nothing but a letter of recommendation and a passion for Mozart. Their love had been brief, desperate, and hidden in the only place that could keep a secret in that great white-columned house, the music room, after the household had gone to bed, while the Broadwood Grand stood silent witness beneath its heavy velvet cover. The piano had been a gift from Margaret's father in 1845, shipped from London, carried upriver on a flatboat, installed with champagne and speeches. It had watched everything. By the spring of 1847 the truth could no longer be corseted away. The family's reputation, built on cotton, rice, slaves, and the unassailable appearance of Southern virtue, stood at the edge of ruin. What happened next, Whitfield wrote, was the greatest shame our family ever committed, and the one I can no longer carry into the grave. Thomas's hands were shaking now. The letter went on for pages, detailing the ruthless calculation of a planter patriarch who would rather destroy innocence than allow scandal. It spoke of midnight decisions, hushed conversations behind closed doors, and a single, terrible choice made in the name of honor. Outside the workshop windows, the Savannah River kept flowing, indifferent. Inside, the dismantled Broadwood lay open like a body on an autopsy table, its heart exposed, its secret finally breathing again after 170 years of silence. Thomas did not call Edmund Hartwell that night. Instead he locked the heavy oak door, carried the letter home through the gaslit streets of Savannah, and sat in his study until dawn. The gas lamp flickered. Shadows moved across the walls like accusing fingers. He read the letter until he could recite it from memory, until the elegant handwriting felt burned behind his eyes. He thought of the biblical warning he had learned as a boy, be sure your sin will find you out. He thought of how long this piano had waited, through war, reconstruction, fire, flood, and the slow decay of empires, to deliver its testimony. And he understood, with a chill that went deeper than the river mist, that some sins are not meant to stay hidden. They are only buried, until the right hands, in the right workshop, on the right Tuesday in late September, finally set them free. The Broadwood Grand was no longer just an instrument. It had become the voice of the dead. And Thomas Vance, whether he wanted the burden or not, had just been chosen as its witness. The letter did not end with gentle regret. It descended. James Whitfield's elegant handwriting grew tighter, the ink darker in places where the pen had pressed harder, as though the very act of writing reopened old wounds. Richard Ashworth, the iron-willed patriarch of one of South Carolina's most powerful planting dynasties, had not simply handled the scandal. He had executed a sentence. In the brutal spring of 1847, when Margaret's condition could no longer be hidden beneath whalebone and silk, her father summoned no physician. Doctors in those days were dangerous enough for ordinary births; for this kind of problem, they were impossible. Instead, Richard Ashworth turned to older, darker methods whispered about in slave quarters and back rooms of great houses when reputations hung by a thread. The letter did not name the woman who performed the procedure, nor the exact instruments used. It only said the act was carried out in the dead of night inside the music room itself, beneath the same Broadwood Grand that now lay disassembled on Thomas Vance's workbench. Margaret survived the ordeal. Barely. But something inside her died that night. The letter described how she lay feverish for weeks, bleeding, screaming into pillows while the household pretended nothing was happening. When she finally rose from her bed, her body had been altered forever. The trauma had sealed her womb. She would never carry another child. Never hold her own infant. Never know the ordinary mercy of motherhood that even the poorest field hand was sometimes granted. Worse still was the fracture in her spirit. From that night forward, Margaret Ashworth, once the radiant young woman whose fingers could make the Broadwood weep with Chopin and Beethoven, became a ghost in her own home. She played the piano for hours every day, but the music changed. It grew haunted, minor-key, full of unresolved dissonances that made listeners shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Guests whispered that her playing sounded like mourning. Her father forbade her from performing in public after 1848. She was kept inside the white-columned mansion on the Ashley River, a beautiful prisoner whose only companion was the instrument that had witnessed her violation and her loss. James Whitfield had not been allowed to stay and comfort her. The morning after the procedure, two of Richard Ashworth's most trusted overseers appeared at Whitfield's modest quarters. They handed him a heavy leather purse, more money than a music tutor could earn in 20 years, and delivered the patriarch's final command: leave South Carolina before sunset. Never write. Never return. Never speak the Ashworth name again. If he disobeyed, the same men who had just solved the family problem would solve him as well. Whitfield fled up the coast to Savannah. He tried to forget. He taught scales to merchant children. He composed small, polite sonatas that no one remembered. He drank alone by the river at night and woke screaming from dreams in which Margaret's voice called his name from inside the piano. 12 years of guilt ate him from the inside until, in the winter of 1859, coughing blood into his handkerchief, he sat down and wrote the letter that would one day find Thomas Vance. He addressed it to Catherine Ashworth, Margaret's mother, because he believed a mother might still possess enough mercy to do what a father had refused. He hid it inside the only safe place he knew, the instrument that had been present for every moment of the tragedy. The piano Margaret still played every single day, never knowing a confession lay inches from her fingers. When Thomas finished reading the letter for the fourth time, the gas lamp in his study had burned low. The flame guttered, throwing shadows that looked like reaching hands across the walls. He sat motionless until the first gray light of dawn crept through the curtains. Outside, the Savannah River kept its ancient rhythm, indifferent to human shame. This was no longer a restoration. This was an exhumation. The next morning Thomas began to hunt for proof. He moved like a man possessed, quiet, relentless, methodical. First the Savannah Public Library, where he pored over yellowed microfilm until his eyes burned. Then the Georgia Historical Society, where archivists brought him boxes of brittle correspondence. Finally, the Charleston Courthouse and the South Carolina Historical Society, where he spent long days breathing dust that tasted of rice fields and old sorrow. Every discovery deepened the wound. Richard Ashworth had indeed been a titan. Thousands of acres. Hundreds of enslaved people. A name spoken with deference in every drawing room from Charleston to Georgetown. He died in 1862, early in the war, struck down by a Yankee shell outside Richmond. Some said divine timing, others said simple battlefield luck. His wife Catherine outlived him until 1885. Margaret lingered until 1891, unmarried, childless, increasingly reclusive. Society columns from the 1850s still praised her angelic touch at the piano, but after 1847 the praise grew thinner, laced with polite concern about her delicate health and a mysterious European tour that conveniently removed her from low-country society for nearly a year. Thomas found the exact dates. Margaret and her mother had sailed for England in May 1847. They returned in April 1848. The timing matched Whitfield's letter with cruel precision. Whitfield himself appeared in Savannah records exactly as described, arrived 1847, taught music, composed minor works, died of inflammation of the lungs in January 1859 at age 42. No wife. No children. A quiet, solitary man whose landlady remembered him as polite but haunted, always staring at the river as if waiting for something to surface. The piano's own journey told its own silent story. It remained in the Ashworth house through the Civil War, through Sherman's march that spared the mansion but burned the fields, through the ruin of Reconstruction. In the 1920s, when the last Ashworth heir died broke, it was sold to a Charleston dealer. From there it drifted through private collections until it landed in that remote low-country estate auction where Edmund Hartwell found it. Every piece fit. Yet the most damning details, the forced termination, the exact method, the blood on the music room floor, existed only inside Whitfield's letter. No ledger recorded it. No doctor's note. No slave testimony survived in writing. The Ashworths had buried the truth so completely that even history had been complicit. Thomas felt the weight of it like a physical pressure on his chest. For weeks he worked on the piano by day and researched by night. His hands repaired cracks in the soundboard with surgical precision while his mind replayed Margaret's imagined screams. He replaced rusted pins and aged strings while thinking of Whitfield coughing blood onto paper in a cold Savannah room. He rebuilt the action, each tiny hammer, each felted shank, and wondered how many times Margaret had struck those same keys afterward, trying to drown her pain in music. The moral question gnawed at him constantly. Should he simply finish the restoration, deliver the piano to Hartwell, and let the letter disappear back into private hands? Should he turn it over to historians and let the Ashworth name, long faded but still whispered with respect in certain circles, be dragged into modern judgment? Or should he do something more difficult, honor the dead by telling the story with care, without turning tragedy into spectacle? He prayed over it. Not the polished prayers of childhood, but raw, honest ones spoken aloud in the empty workshop while the river whispered outside. He asked for wisdom to distinguish between justice and vengeance, between exposing sin and exploiting suffering. In the end, Thomas chose responsibility. On a crisp Friday afternoon in early November, with the workshop smelling of fresh varnish and linseed oil, he called Edmund Hartwell. "Sir, I need you to come to the workshop. There's something you must see. It concerns the Broadwood, and it concerns the Ashworth family in a way no one expected." Hartwell arrived within 2 hours, his expensive car pulling up outside the warehouse. The collector still carried himself with the quiet confidence of old money, but when Thomas placed the brittle letter in his hands and watched him read, that confidence cracked. Hartwell read it once in silence. Then again, lips moving slightly. His face went through stages: disbelief, recognition, a kind of fascinated revulsion. When he finally looked up, his voice was hoarse. "My God, this is real?" Thomas nodded. "Every external record I could find supports the timeline and the people. The worst details only exist here. But I believe James Whitfield was telling the truth with his dying breath." They stood together beside the half-reassembled piano, its mahogany case gleaming now under fresh polish, its exposed interior still raw like an open wound. Hartwell asked the question that had kept Thomas awake for weeks. "What do we do with this?" Thomas had prepared his answer carefully. "We do not sensationalize it. We do not use it to shame the dead for sport. But we also do not bury it again." Margaret Ashworth suffered in silence for 44 years. James Whitfield carried the guilt until it killed him. The piano kept their secret long enough. Now it's time the truth is handled with the same reverence we give to restoring the instrument itself. Hartwell stared at the letter for a long moment, then at the piano that had guarded it for nearly 2 centuries. He exhaled slowly. "Then we finish the restoration, and we decide together how the story is told. Because this piano is no longer just an antique. It has become something else." Thomas felt A strange peace settled over him for the first time since he had pulled that paper from the darkness. Outside, the Savannah River continued its slow, eternal flow, carrying away the silt of old plantations, old sins, old silences. But some truths, once released, refuse to be carried away. They demand to be heard. And the Broadwood Grand, slowly returning to its former glory under Thomas Vance's hands, was about to sing again, this time with a voice that carried more than music. It carried judgment. It carried memory. It carried the long-delayed cry of a woman who had been robbed of her future inside the very instrument meant to bring her joy. And somewhere, in the spiritual economy that governs such things, perhaps Margaret Ashworth and James Whitfield were finally being allowed to rest. Because their secret had found the one man willing to listen. The question hung between them like incense in an empty church: what do we do with this, Thomas? Edmund Hartwell stood beside the half-rebuilt Broadwood, the letter trembling slightly in his manicured hands. The afternoon light slanting through the warehouse windows painted long golden bars across the workbench, turning floating dust into slow-moving spirits. Outside, the Savannah River murmured its eternal, indifferent hymn. Together, they chose the path of cautious stewardship. They would not bury the letter again. Neither would they hurl it into the world like a grenade. Instead, they reached out to Dr. Elena Hartley, a respected historian at the University of South Carolina whose life's work was peeling back the polished veneer of low-country planter society to reveal the raw flesh beneath. Her books on antebellum gender, power, and silence were required reading for anyone serious about Southern history. They packaged the fragile document with Thomas's exhaustive research notes, photographs of the piano's hidden compartment, and a carefully worded cover letter. Then they waited. Dr. Hartley's reply arrived in exactly 7 days. Her assessment was meticulous, almost surgical. Using every tool modern forensics could offer: digital handwriting analysis, fiber microscopy, ink spectrometry, carbon dating of microscopic samples, she declared the letter physically genuine. The paper was consistent with mid-19th century stock. The ink matched formulations used before the Civil War. The handwriting bore strong similarities to authenticated samples of James Whitfield's script from Savannah teaching records. The historical scaffolding also held Richard Ashworth's vast holdings, Margaret's documented musical talent and later reclusion, Whitfield's sudden disappearance from Low Country records in 1847, his quiet life and early death in Savannah. All of it checked. Yet Dr. Hartley added a sober warning that sent a chill through both men. This is a confession, not courtroom evidence. James Whitfield was not present in the room when the procedure occurred. He was already banished. What he wrote is powerful testimony filtered through 12 years of guilt, grief, and distance. Some details may be hearsay. Some may be shaped by his own desire for redemption. The full truth may be more layered, more human, and far messier than this single anguished voice suggests. Still, she believed the letter was historically significant enough to warrant deeper scholarly attention. She recommended formal submission to the South Carolina Historical Society and eventual publication in a peer-reviewed journal. So began the second, more public chapter of the Broadwood's long silence breaking. The Historical Society's experts subjected the letter to even stricter scrutiny. Conservators in white gloves and magnifying visors examined it under special lighting. Handwriting analysts compared stroke pressure and slant. Historians cross-referenced every name, date, and social detail against thousands of pages of plantation ledgers, church records, and private correspondence. The consensus was careful, almost reluctant. The document appeared authentic as a 1859 artifact. Its broad narrative was plausible within the brutal social logic of the time. Yet the most explosive claims, the pregnancy, the clandestine termination performed in the music room itself, the exact nature of Margaret's trauma remained uncorroborated by any independent source. No medical records. No midwife's account. No slave testimony preserved in writing. Only the elegant, heartbroken words of a dying music tutor, and a constellation of circumstantial shadows: Margaret's sudden withdrawal from society, her European tour at the exact right moment, her lifelong spinsterhood, the family's uncharacteristic silence in the spring of 1847. In the spring of 1998, 151 years after the events described, the Society published a carefully worded article in its flagship journal. Dr. Hartley and her colleagues presented the letter as a remarkable primary document offering rare insight into the private anxieties and moral compromises of the antebellum planter elite. They emphasized its value as a window into hidden histories rather than as conclusive proof of any single crime. They could not have anticipated the firestorm that followed. The article hit academic circles like a quiet bomb. Then newspapers picked it up. Then television. Within weeks, the story of the piano that held a confession became national news. Living Ashworth descendants, some still wealthy, influential, and protective of their gilded legacy, reacted with fury. Public statements were issued. Lawyers were retained. Counter-historians were hired to dismantle the letter's credibility. They correctly pointed out the absence of hard evidence. They painted James Whitfield as a jilted lover seeking posthumous revenge. They suggested the entire narrative was a convenient fiction crafted by a man who had seduced a young woman and then abandoned her, only to blame her powerful father when guilt finally consumed him. The debate spilled far beyond academia. News vans parked outside Thomas's quiet workshop. Reporters wanted sound bites from the humble restorer who had unleashed this ghost. Camera lights flooded the space where the Broadwood now stood nearly complete, its mahogany glowing like fresh blood under fresh polish, its new strings humming faintly when the river wind moved through the open windows. Thomas hated the attention. He had always preferred the company of tools, wood, and music. Now strangers recognized him on the street. His mailbox overflowed. Some letters came from serious genealogists offering new leads. Others arrived from conspiracy enthusiasts claiming the Ashworths had murdered Whitfield or that the piano itself was cursed. Elderly people wrote claiming their grandmothers had whispered Ashworth family secrets on porches at twilight. A few descendants sent polite but icy notes defending their ancestors' honor. One or two even expressed quiet gratitude that Margaret's suffering might finally be acknowledged. Through it all, Thomas continued working on the piano with the same reverent precision. He fitted the restored action back into the case. He regulated the hammers until each key responded with perfect touch. He tuned the strings until the Broadwood's voice rang clear and resonant once more, a voice that now felt heavier, wiser, burdened with memory. Yet as the public storm raged, a private unease began to grow inside him. Something felt off. At first he dismissed it as exhaustion. The weight of sudden fame. The moral vertigo of having exhumed a 19th-century tragedy. But the feeling persisted, a subtle discord, like a single wrong note hidden inside a perfect chord. He returned to the letter with fresh eyes. Night after night, under the same gas lamp that had first illuminated those faded words, Thomas studied it again. He compared the handwriting against every authenticated sample of Whitfield's script he could locate. He examined the paper under magnification, tracing its fibers and watermarks. He analyzed the ink's degradation pattern. He even unfolded and refolded the document exactly as it had been found, noting the precise creases and how they had nestled into the piano's hidden gap. Small anomalies began to surface. The handwriting showed an almost unnatural uniformity. A man writing under the shadow of death, racked with guilt and tuberculosis, should have produced a more erratic hand, trembling strokes. Uneven pressure, perhaps even tears blurring the ink. Instead, every line maintained an elegant, almost literary precision. The paper, while convincingly old, carried subtle characteristics that didn't perfectly align with 1859 manufacturing records Thomas had cross-checked. The ink faded with suspicious evenness as if it had been aged deliberately rather than naturally over decades of damp southern storage. Most troubling was the narrative structure itself. The letter read less like a raw deathbed confession torn from a tormented soul and more like a carefully composed literary document, complete with rising tension, tragic heroine, ruthless villain, and a morally satisfying call for justice. It had an arc. A shape. A rhetorical power that felt almost too perfect for a dying music tutor pouring out his heart in a cold room by the river. Thomas began to lose sleep. He sat in the workshop after midnight, the completed Broadwood gleaming silently beside him, and whispered questions into the darkness. What if the letter was not a confession at all, but something else? What if it had been written not by James Whitfield in 1859, but by someone later, someone who understood the power of a hidden document inside a beautiful instrument. Someone who wanted the Ashworth name stained, or perhaps wanted Margaret's suffering remembered in the most dramatic way possible? Or, a far more disturbing thought, what if the piano itself had been used as an instrument of calculated revenge or redemption by someone inside the family circle? The more Thomas examined the evidence, the more the ground beneath the entire story seemed to shift. He had restored the piano to its original glory. Its voice now sang with heartbreaking clarity, the same voice that had once accompanied Margaret Ashworth's private agony and James Whitfield's forbidden love. But now that voice carried a new question, one that echoed louder than any melody. Had the Broadwood been guarding a truth, or had it been hiding a masterpiece of deception crafted across generations? Thomas Vance, craftsman, restorer, reluctant witness, stood at the center of a mystery that had just become far more dangerous. Because if the letter was not what it claimed to be, then every expert, every headline, every outraged descendant had been drawn into a performance that began in 1847, and might still be playing out more than 150 years later. And the piano, now fully restored and resonant, was once again the silent, perfect accomplice. Waiting. Watching. Ready for the next note to fall. The question arrived like a blade slipped between ribs. What if the letter was never genuine at all? Thomas Vance sat alone in his workshop long after the museum curators had taken the restored Broadwood away. The space felt unnaturally empty without the massive mahogany instrument that had dominated it for months. Only the faint scent of aged wood, linseed oil, and river mist remained, along with the ghost of that brittle paper he had pulled from the piano's hidden heart. He had shared his growing doubts with Dr. Elena Hartley in a careful, late-night phone call. Her response had been measured, professional, but edged with the subtle defensiveness of someone whose reputation now rested partly on the letter's authenticity. She admitted the anomalies deserved scrutiny. The unnatural uniformity of the handwriting. The suspiciously even aging of the ink. The almost literary polish of a document supposedly written by a dying, guilt-ridden man coughing blood in a cold Savannah room. Yet she stood by the expert consensus: the physical document was consistent with 1,859 materials. The historical details aligned too closely with verifiable facts to dismiss outright. Still, she conceded the uncomfortable truth every honest historian eventually faces: absolute certainty in the past is a luxury rarely granted. Documents can be forged with terrifying skill. Experts can be deceived by brilliance. And this letter, for all its power, could not be proven beyond every shadow of doubt. That sliver of uncertainty became the battlefield. The Ashworth descendants' legal team pounced. They launched a fierce counter-campaign, branding the letter a sophisticated modern forgery designed by someone with a deep grudge against the family. They demanded it be removed from the historical record, dismissed as malicious fiction. They argued, correctly on technical grounds, that no independent evidence proved Margaret Ashworth had ever been pregnant, that no records confirmed a forced termination in the music room, that the entire narrative rested on the word of one man who had every reason to rewrite history in his favor. Most academic historians pushed back. They cited the letter's emotional authenticity, its consistency with the social pressures of the planter class, and the absence of any clear motive for such an elaborate hoax. Why would anyone go to such painstaking lengths to forge a document, hide it so cleverly, and then trust that it would one day be found? Thomas, however, could not let the question rest. Working quietly, away from cameras and academic committees, he dug deeper into the piano's provenance, the chain of ownership that had been glossed over in the initial excitement. What he uncovered sent ice through his veins. The Broadwood had not stayed continuously in Ashworth hands until the 1920s, as many assumed. After the family's fortunes crumbled, it was sold to a Charleston antique dealer. From there its path grew fragmented: private collectors, estates, auctions. But the final link before Edmund Hartwell bought it at that remote low-country sale was devastatingly clear. In the 1990s, the piano had belonged to a woman named Ella Hartwell. She died childless in 1995 at age 93. Her estate auction was where the Broadwood finally surfaced again. And her maiden name, the name Thomas discovered with a jolt that stopped his breath, had been Ashworth. Ella Hartwell was a direct, though distant, descendant of Richard Ashworth, the Iron Patriarch. She had lived a long, intellectually rigorous life. a respected member of the South Carolina Historical Society. A woman who corresponded extensively with historians and genealogists. Her letters, preserved in society archives, revealed an almost obsessive devotion to excavating her family's past. She spoke repeatedly of hidden truths, silences that shame us, and the moral duty to confront the uncomfortable realities beneath the polished columns and Spanish moss. She had access to the piano. She had the education, the resources, and the archival knowledge to craft a convincing 19th-century document. She had the motive, perhaps a desire to force her own descendants, and the broader South, to reckon with the human cost of the family's legendary respectability. A new, darker hypothesis took root in Thomas's mind like a seed planted in wet low-country soil. What if Elalina Hartwell had written the letter herself in the decades before her death? What if she had studied every surviving scrap of family correspondence, every diary, every rumor? What if she had deliberately composed a confession so emotionally powerful, so historically plausible, that it would pass every reasonable test? What if she had hidden it inside the very piano that had witnessed, or was said to have witnessed, the original tragedy, knowing with cold certainty that its next owner would eventually have it restored, and that the hidden compartment would one day be discovered? Not a lie born of malice, perhaps, but a carefully constructed truth or a carefully constructed parable meant to drag a long-buried family sin into the unforgiving light of the late 20th century. Thomas never found smoking gun proof. No confession from Elalina. No draft pages. No witness who saw her working on the letter. Only the constellation of circumstances, her bloodline, her obsession, her timing, and the subtle artistic perfection of the document itself. He chose silence. He did not publish his suspicions. He did not call press conferences or write op-eds. The letter had already entered the historical record. The article had been published. The museum plaque had been cast. The Broadwood, now fully restored, its mahogany gleaming, its keys luminous ivory once more, its soundboard singing with heartbreaking resonance, had been donated to a prominent Charleston museum where it stands today. Visitors gather around it. School children. Historians. Tourists seeking the romance of Southern ghosts. They read the plaque that tells the story of the letter found inside. They listen when guest pianists are occasionally allowed to perform on the instrument. The music that rises from its depths is said to carry an almost supernatural melancholy, clear, rich, and layered with something deeper than mere notes. Something that feels like memory. Like unresolved grief. Like the long echo of a woman's silenced voice. Thomas Vance returned to his quiet life in Savannah. He continued restoring pianos with the same reverence and precision that had defined his career. His hands still moved with grace over aged mechanisms and yellowed keys. He never sought the spotlight again. But in the still hours before dawn, when the Savannah River mist clung to the warehouse windows, he would sometimes sit with a cup of coffee and stare at the photographs he had taken of the letter. He never forgot the strange duality he felt when he first read those elegant lines, the sense that he was holding something simultaneously profoundly true and profoundly false. A document that exposed real pain, the pain of a society that prized reputation over mercy, of women whose bodies and futures were currency in the ledger of family honor. Yet a document that may itself have been an act of calculated historical theater. The definitive truth about the spring of 1847, whether Margaret Ashworth truly carried James Whitfield's child, whether her father ordered a brutal termination in the music room itself, whether the piano absorbed her screams along with her music, remains shrouded. No medical records survived. No reliable eyewitness accounts. Only the elegant, haunting letter, and the circumstantial shadows that still whisper around the edges of the Ashworth name. In his later years, Thomas often reflected that this uncertainty might be history's most honest gift. We want certainty. We crave clear villains and pure victims, neat moral arcs, definitive justice. But the past rarely cooperates. It offers fragments. It offers stories woven from guilt, love, shame, and self-preservation. Sometimes those stories are true. Sometimes they are beautiful lies crafted by later hands seeking redemption or revenge or simply the need to be remembered. The Broadwood Grand stands in its museum case, silent and magnificent. Its restored voice can still fill a concert hall with transcendent beauty. But no one who listens can escape the knowledge that this instrument once carried something far heavier than music inside its wooden heart. A secret. Or a masterpiece of deception. Or perhaps both at once, a vessel that holds the tension between what we desperately want to believe happened and what we can never fully prove. That tension is what makes the story endure. It reminds us that some sins are buried so deeply, with such care and calculation, that even when the coffin is opened, we may never be certain whose hand truly nailed it shut. Thomas Vance never played the restored Broadwood after its donation. He said the instrument had already sung its most important note, the long, unresolved chord that still vibrates through Southern memory. A chord of guilt. A chord of grace. A chord that asks, even now, what are we willing to hide to protect the names we love, and what price are we willing to pay when those hidden things finally find their way back into the light? The piano waits in Charleston, polished, tuned, and ready. Its keys gleam under museum lights like ancient teeth that have learned patience. And somewhere in the spiritual architecture that governs such things, the slow, divine justice that outlasts both forgers and patriarchs, perhaps Margaret Ashworth, James Whitfield, and even Ella Lenina Hartwell have all been given their hearing. Because the Broadwood did what it was always meant to do. It kept the silence. Until it didn't. And in the space between truth and deception, between confession and creation, between 1847 and today, the instrument still resonates with the most haunting sound of all. The sound of a question that refuses to resolve.